Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. The U.S. Department of Justice unsealed an indictment charging 24 North Korean and Chinese individuals with laundering more than $2.5 billion throughout the global financial system. North Korea moves to increase its nuclear strength, while there are speculations that South Korea may be moving towards lifting the May 24th unilateral sanctions. Today, we discuss these and more. Joining us today is Evans Revere, non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Revere served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He's a senior fellow for Korea Studies and director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of 50 years of South Korean foreign policy and offers predictions. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Connie.
Thank you. Now, I want to get started with North Korea's meeting of the Central Military Commission. So, what was your takeaway from this meeting, and did you see anything new from this meeting?
I was struck by the fact that the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, made a point of talking about new policies that were going to be developed in order to deal with North Korea's nuclear weapons program, specifically strengthening the deterrent effect of North Korea's nuclear weapons. The statement that he made was a bit cryptic. It's not clear what all the details are in terms of what his intentions are. But the impact of the message, I think, is potentially significant because it tells us that the North Koreans are going to focus on perhaps new policies, approaches, or some new military doctrine that will enable them to enhance the degree to which they can deter the United States with their nuclear weapons.
So the wording from the North Korean state media said that Kim Jong-un has set forth new policies to increase its nuclear war deterrence. So was this anything new, or was this in line with last year's party plenum, Mr. Snyder?
Well, I see it as implementing the directives of last year's party plenum to the extent that we see something new. And I don't disagree with Evans, but I think that the newness is going to come in the level of detail involved in executing the direction that was set by the party plenum. And we saw some adjustments in terms of personnel, focuses on procedures that would be necessary in order to technically implement this goal of enhancing nuclear deterrence.
Mm-hmm. So commenting on this meeting, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said that North Korea must give up its nuclear weapons for a great economy. And the Trump administration has been relatively quiet publicly in terms of North Korea. So how do you think the U.S. should be dealing with North Korea?
Well, my own sense is that the National Security Advisor's comments were in keeping with the comments of virtually every national security advisor that I can remember talking about this issue for the last quarter century plus, encouraging North Korea to do something that North Korea has no intention of doing. And in terms of policy recommendations, I think it's important for the United States to recognize that the best efforts of this administration, like the best efforts of every previous U.S. administration, have been insufficient to convince North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. And so we're going to have to try a different approach, and in my view, a much more focused, much more intense, a much more aggressive approach designed to convince North Korea through isolation and pressure and other mechanisms that the path that it is on is unsustainable and could lead to the collapse of the regime.
We are at a standstill in terms of U.S.-North Korea talks. And there has been criticism that the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign has weakened. The Department of Justice charged 28 North Koreans and 5 Chinese with laundering more than $2.5 billion in diverting its illegal funds to North Korea's nuclear weapons program. So how did you see this administration's approach in tracking down North Korea's sanctions violations?
Well, I think that, this sort of move by the Department of Justice, it takes a lot of time to put into place. And so, this is, I think, part of an effort to enhance pressure on North Korea. But the scope and magnitude of the violations that were reported suggests just how limited and relatively ineffective the U.S. has been. You're talking $2.5 billion that has gone through the international financial system directed by North Koreans. And so it does point to, hopefully, a more strict approach. But as we have seen with the prior executive orders, focusing on designating individuals, we've got to go further than designating individuals. They're going to have to actually be actions that prevent these flows from continuing.
I strongly concur with what Scott has just said, but I would add that and underscore that not only U.S. efforts, but international efforts, as the UN Security Council of Experts has reported, international efforts have fallen short in terms of applying the requisite amount of pressure on the North Korean regime. The administration, the U.S. administration, likes to use the word maximum pressure. I think if you look back over the years, this administration, like previous administrations, has never achieved a maximum level of pressure on North Korea, hence the discovery of these additional violations. And we're just going to have to lift our game. And I think the recommendation that I made a few moments ago is the way to do that.
So there is a kind of broad, warning effect to financial institutions not to engage in business with these individuals. But what we haven't yet seen is a tangible penalty attached to interaction with these individuals. And so I think that is the other shoe that may have to drop if we're going to actually see effective sanctions implementation.
Mm-hmm. So some experts do point out that this action showed the administration's approach on North Korea, pursuing dialogue and exerting pressure on North Korea. But it seems, on the other hand, in South Korea, there are moves to lift the May 24 unilateral sanctions on North Korea, as this year marks the 10th year of imposing these measures on North Korea. So there are speculations in South Korea that the government is trying to move to lift these measures. Do you think this move is necessary? Do you think these moves should be taken?
These are, of course, sovereign decisions for the Republic of Korea to make. But I think that decisions like this, in terms of easing unilateral sanctions that have been applied on North Korea, decisions like that should be taken in the context of an understanding of the importance of putting pressure on North Korea to denuclearize and compelling North Korea to act responsibly. And obviously, the sinking of a South Korean warship by North Korea is hardly a responsible act, a very irresponsible act. And so I think it's unfortunate that we're seeing South Korea move in this direction. And I hope that the decision, if one is coming, will be deferred and reconsidered.
Well, I would say that the Moon administration has a political problem and a strategic problem. And the political problem is that Moon's supporters want to see more engagement with North Korea, and the May 24th measures date back to a conservative administration. And so there's a natural push, especially in light of the April 15th elections, by supporters of the Moon administration to want to see more inter-Korean engagement, if indeed the North Koreans would ever allow it. But the strategic problem, I think, is the more serious one, and that is the risk by prematurely relaxing May 24th sanctions without having North Korea make any admission of responsibility or wrongdoing related to the Cheonan incident. And essentially the problem there is that relaxation of sanctions prematurely reinforces North Korea's impunity, the possibility that North Korea can just do as it pleases without the expectation of any penalty in the international community or even in the inter-Korean relationship.
So like both of you mentioned, North Korea has never offered regret on the incident or offered an apology on the sinking of the Cheonan naval ship. But within South Korea, like Mr. Snyder has mentioned, there is growing calls within the ruling party to lift these measures that South Korea imposed 10 years ago. So what should we make of these calls, Mr. Revere?
I understand what's behind that decision, but I don't think it's the appropriate way to go. But it is and will remain, I think, a high priority for a liberal administration in Seoul to continue to prioritize North-South dialogue over other issues. And it's yet another area in which, let's say, Seoul and Washington are not necessarily seeing eye to eye, because Washington has a very different priority.
So one of the things that the May 24th measures bans is the North Korean vessel sailing in the South Korean territorial waters. And the Unification Ministry said that if the two countries have an agreement on this issue, North Korean vessels could enter into South Korean waters. So should this be allowed, do you have any concerns that this would violate the UN and US sanctions down the road?
Yeah, I think that South Korea, as a member state and as an adherent to the UN Security Council resolutions, will have an obligation to implement the provisions of the Security Council resolutions against North Korea that require stopping and inspecting North Korean vessels that enter into South Korean territorial waters. And so, in a way, I think that the relaxation of bans by South Korea on entry into territorial waters of North Korean vessels actually creates another problem for the Moon administration, and that is adherence to the UN Security Council resolutions.
But there's also a military angle to this as well, of course. The entry of North Korean vessels into South Korean waters presents a potential security problem for the Republic of Korea. And that has implications for the US-ROK alliance. I would suggest to the Republic of Korea government that they will need to make sure that this is coordinated very, very carefully and closely with the United States and, of course, with US Forces Korea, because of the potential for this to undermine our joint security efforts to defend the Republic of Korea.
Mm-hmm. Due to the comprehensive US and UN sanctions, it will be a very sensitive issue for South Korea to go ahead and take these measures. And so a lot of sanctions experts did point out that lifting these set of sanctions are completely under the discretion of the South Korean government. But if South Korea does go ahead and scrap these May 24th measures, can South Korea guarantee that North Korea will not go ahead and launch further provocations against South Korea?
No. I think that the basic problem in the inter-Korean relationship at this time is that the Moon administration, the South Korean government, wants tension relaxation, but the North Koreans have, generally speaking, not been reciprocating and actually are failing to implement elements of the agreements that were made in the course of the Moon-Kim summits. And so as a result, there simply is not a basis upon which to trust North Korean intentions or actions at this time.
I completely agree with that. North Korea has skillfully used provocations of one kind or another for decades to affect its relationship with South Korea, as well as the United States and Japan, of course. And I don't think any reasonable person should expect North Korea to end the reliance that they have had on provocations, military provocations of some sort over the years in the coming days. I just don't think that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. And the State Department has emphasized coordination with South Korea in order to ensure inter-Korean cooperation is in lockstep with denuclearization progress. So we hope to see South Korea's decisions are in line with US's policy on North Korea. Well, that's all the time we have for today, Mr. Revere and Mr. Snyder. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Connie.
Thank you. That does it for today's Washington Talk, and from all of us here at Voice of America. Thank you for watching. Please join us again next week. Goodbye.